In this video, we talk about audit strategy and why it's so important. For many auditors, audit strategy doesn't get a lot of love, but it should. It can be the most important part of the audit file. So let's go to Chapter 18, Audit Strategy and Plan. So here we are in Chapter 18, and I'm going to show you what you need to document in your audit strategy. One of the things that peer reviewers look for is whether or not you've documented this part of the audit. More important than peer review is that you have an appropriate plan that allows you to execute your audit, to get it done the right way, to get it done efficiently. So you're going to see some of this has to do with project management, which is something auditors don't think about very well, and we don't use project management in the way that we should. Consequently, we bump into problems as we perform the audit that makes our budget explode. I mean, have you ever had that happen before? Maybe you plan to spend 150 hours on an engagement and you end up with 250. So if you follow what we're about to look at, I think it will save you some time. I not only think, I'm confident it will save you time. Now, we've talked previously about identifying risk and then connecting the response, what we call linkage. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, so see the video above. But I do want to point out here that as you develop your strategy, you want to connect your identified risk to your response. So we're doing that in the detail audit programs, but we're also doing the same thing in developing the audit strategy. In the audit strategy, we should have information such as this. Number one, characteristics of the engagement. Is this a complex audit, or is it simple? Is it a new entity, or is it an old entity? Number two, reporting objectives. So we need to be thinking about the types of reports that we're going to issue. This will have a direct effect upon the engagement letter. We can't create the engagement letter without knowing what the reporting objectives are. So for example, if you've got a yellow book engagement, that's one of the reporting obligations, and it should be in the engagement letter. It should also be in the strategy part of the audit. Number three, significant factors. So if you've got particular elements within the balance sheet or income statement or disclosures that are highly complex, you want to note those in the audit strategy. If there's any one document that summarizes the whole engagement, it's the audit strategy. If we do this part right, we should be able to look at this one document and get a bird's eye view of the overall engagement, where the risks are, and how we're responding to that in terms of audit staff. Number four, results of preliminary engagement activities. We've spent the last 17 chapters talking about how to get ready to do the audit. So now at this point, we're documenting the key pertinent parts of what we've seen as we've done risk assessment. Number five, knowledge gained from similar engagement. So if you're auditing a bank, and let's say it's a fiducia bank, and you've got another fiducia bank that you audit, think about the other engagement and some of the risk and what you had to do over there, and bring some of those ideas into this engagement if they're relevant. Number six, resources and when they will be needed. So in the audit strategy, we should be documenting who will be on the engagement team What computers do we need? What people do we need in terms of the client personnel? So think about the resources that will be needed. Now, some forms providers don't provide a strategy form, and I don't understand this because really everybody that creates forms that auditors purchase and use for audit purposes, there should be an audit strategy form, but some companies don't provide this. So if you don't have a pre-formatted form from your forms provider, this is the type of information that you could create, say, in a Word document that would give you an audit strategy form. Some forms providers, they have audit steps in the audit program, and they say sign off on the audit steps and that suffices. I can't go there. I think you need an audit strategy form that summarizes the overall ideas in the engagement. So some of the things that would go into the audit strategy form would be the deliverables. So if you're doing an audit report on April the 15th, and then say you're going to do the single audit 2 months later, then you'd want to specify the deliverables and what those deadlines would be. Number 2, the time budget. So we need to plan for when we're going to perform the engagement and when should we finish the engagement. Number 3, the audit team members. So if you've got a highly complex audit, we want more experienced personnel to respond to that overall financial statement level risk. Number 4, the prior year audit problems. Now, this is not required. To me, it just makes sense as part of project management. So if you had particular problems last year, wouldn't you like to avoid those this year? And you can simply by identifying those early on and then planning a means to deal with those issues. So I think in the audit strategy form, step number 4 and number 5 are some of the key components in terms of getting the job done in a timely manner. Think about the problems from last year, and then number 5, anticipated problems this year. So if they, for instance, bought another entity, and now you're consolidating the purchase entity into the financial statements, then there's going to be new wrinkles in the engagement. And you want to anticipate what the problems might be in your financial statements and in the information that you would need to deal with that dynamic. So think about anything that's different for the current year that you didn't have last year and what you will need in order to address those new things. Number 6, high-risk areas. So if, we've spent several chapters looking at risk identification, and now in the audit strategy form, if there are significant risks, I would identify those in the audit strategy form. Usually there's 1, 2, or 3 of those. You don't need to go into a lot of detail here, but you do want to identify what those 2 or 3 significant risk areas are. Again, this form should be the one document in the audit file that you can look at, or anybody else, and see what the critical issues are. See how you're going to respond to problems you've had in the past, to problems you might have in this year, to see who the audit team is and how that audit team should parallel the level of risk that you have. The more risk, the more experienced personnel you need. So we can look at this one document, and it's often just a page or two long, and it would have all this critical information in it. Finally, as we look at Chapter 18, Audit Strategy, we're also looking at the high-level perspective of the audit plan. I still call this the audit program. I'm from the old school. In the audit standards, they call this the audit plan. So you're familiar with this. You'll have an audit program for cash, one for receivables, one for debt, etc. But here we're developing those audit programs, those audit plans for the different account balances, significant transaction cycles, and disclosures. Now, you're going to see in the next 3 videos that there's really only 3 ways to respond to risk in an audit. 1, test the details. 2, substantive analytics. And 3, test of controls. So we're going to use 1 or 2 or even 3 of these in each transaction cycle, account balance, disclosures. Quite often we can use, say, just a test of details to respond to a particular risk related to a relevant assertion. And as you develop the audit program, you are assigning the relevant assertions to these audit steps. We talked about linkage before. Again, I encourage you to watch my linkage video. And it'll give you more information about it. But part of the linkage is specifying the relevant assertions in the audit program steps. Now, those steps can be just like a test of detail, such as sending a bank confirmation or vouching invoices for additions to plant, property, and equipment. That's an example of a test of details. Substantive analytics we typically use in relation to transaction cycles, such as your revenue transaction cycle. So we might look at revenues in detail over each month of the year or each quarter of the year, or we might compare quarterly revenues this year with quarterly revenues the last 2 years. And then third, there's a test of controls. So you can use a combination of these 3, or you could use just one of these depending on what the audit step is and what the audit risk is. And we're going to take a deep dive on each one of these. You'll see a video for test of details. The next video will be substantive analytics, and then the one after that will be test of controls. Now, before I go today, I want to address one more issue, and that's the black swan phenomenon. And so what is a black swan? Well, it's a high impact, low probability event. Nicholas Taleb wrote a book about this called Black Swan, and he talks about how some events in life are highly improbable, but if they happen, there's a tremendous impact. This same idea applies to audits. There are some issues in some audits that there's a very low probability that it might occur, but if it does, it can be explosive and have a very adverse impact. So once you do your risk assessment and you put your plan together, or as you're putting your plan together, if there is a niggling possibility, that's one of those things that just kind of bothers you as you're planning the engagement, and you don't see a high risk for that one niggling possibility, but you know that it could happen. And because it could be very explosive, then you may desire to plan some audit steps in relation to the black swan possibility. In most engagements, you're not going to have a black swan. I'm just saying in some, you will. And so if you do your risk assessment and there's one area or two areas where you're just not quite sure, then go ahead and plan a response to those risks, even though they're low probability risk. If you do so, you'll sleep better at night. So that's Chapter 18, Audit Strategy and Audit Programs or Audit Plans. Once you've done your risk assessment, this is where you plan your engagement in terms of these documents. We've said that the audit strategy is just a summary document, and it's the one document that gives us an overview of the entire engagement, where the risks are and how we're going to respond. And then the audit programs are those detailed steps that we're using in relation to account balances, transaction cycles, and disclosures. So stay with us. In the future videos, we'll look at test of details, substantive analytics, and test of controls. Until we meet again, take care and bye now.